A silent beginning. When Emma and John Matthews first considered adoption, they had no idea just how much it would change their lives. For years, they had dreamed of starting a family. But after countless failed fertility treatments, the crushing disappointment was more than they could bear. Emma had always imagined herself as a mother, holding a baby in her arms, rocking them to sleep, hearing the sound of small footsteps in their home. The silence, however, had become unbearable. Their once vibrant home, filled with hopeful dreams of a family, now felt like an echo chamber of loss. One evening, after yet another unsuccessful attempt, John brought up the idea of adoption again. It wasn't the first time they had discussed it, but this time felt different. The idea took hold in Emma's heart. Perhaps there was another way to build the family they so desperately wanted. Weeks passed as Emma and John immersed themselves in research. They read stories about families who had adopted, learning about the challenges and rewards of welcoming a child into their home. They contacted adoption agencies, attended informational meetings, and slowly hope began to grow again. One day, while browsing through adoption profiles, a photo caught Emma's eye. It was of a little girl, no older than 5, with big, soulful eyes and tightly coiled curls framing her small face. Her name was Maya. She sat alone in the photo, her expression serious, and something about her gaze felt deep, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her tiny shoulders. "Maya," Emma whispered, turning the laptop screen toward John. "Look at her." John glanced at the photo, and after a moment, he said softly, "There's something about her, isn't there?" Emma nodded. She couldn't explain it, but something about Maya called to her. After a brief phone call to the agency, Emma learned that Maya was a mute. She had been found wandering alone in a park several months ago, and despite efforts to locate her family, no one had come forward. Maya hadn't spoken a single word since she was brought to the orphanage. The social worker's voice on the other end of the line was gentle, but she made it clear. Adopting Maya will come with challenges. We believe she may have experienced significant trauma. She's withdrawn, doesn't interact much with others, and hasn't spoken since we found her. Most families are hesitant to adopt children with her history. But Emma didn't hesitate. She felt something deep in her soul, a connection she couldn't ignore. "We'd like to meet her," Emma said, her voice filled with determination. The day they visited the orphanage was warm, with sunlight filtering through the trees outside. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as they walked through the doors. The building was lively with the sound of children's laughter, but Maya was nowhere to be seen. "She's in the quiet room," the social worker, Mrs. Daniels, explained as she led them down a quieter hallway. "Maya doesn't like loud noises. She tends to isolate herself." When they entered the room, Emma's heart clenched. There she was, Maya, sitting by herself at a small table, her dark eyes focused on a coloring book. She didn't look up when they entered, seemingly lost in her own world. "Hi, Maya," Emma said softly as she knelt beside the little girl. "I'm Emma, and this is John." Maya's hand stilled for a moment, her crayon hovering over the page. But she didn't lift her gaze. John crouched down beside Emma, trying to engage her. "What are you drawing, Maya?" "That's a beautiful picture." For a brief second, Maya's eyes flicked toward them. Emma could see the guardedness in her expression, the wall she had built around herself. She wasn't like the other children they had seen laughing and playing. Maya was different, fragile, as if one wrong move might cause her to withdraw even further. "She doesn't speak," Mrs. Daniels reminded them gently from behind. Emma reached out slowly, placing her hand on the table near Maya, not touching her but close enough to show that she was there, present. Maya's eyes shifted toward Emma's hand for just a second, then back to her drawing. "It's okay," Emma whispered. "We're here for you." The visit was brief, and Maya never spoke a word, but something had shifted. As they left the orphanage, Emma couldn't stop thinking about her. "She's the one," Emma said quietly as they drove home. John didn't need convincing. He had seen it too, the way Emma connected with Maya, even in silence. The adoption process was long and filled with obstacles: home visits, psychological evaluations, and endless paperwork. But Emma and John never wavered. They prepared their home, read books about childhood trauma, and even started learning sign language in the hopes that Maya might communicate through it one day. Finally, after months of waiting, the day came. Maya was officially theirs. When they brought her home, Maya didn't react. She clung tightly to the small backpack she had brought from the orphanage, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Emma had hoped for a smile, some sign that Maya felt safe or happy, but there was nothing. Maya simply stood, silent and still. John knelt down to her level. "Maya, welcome home," he said softly, offering her a small teddy bear they had picked out just for her. Maya took the bear, holding it tightly to her chest. But still, she said nothing. The days that followed were quiet. Maya rarely left her room. She didn't interact with Emma or John, and though they tried their best to engage her, she remained locked in her own world of silence. Emma felt helpless. She had known it would be difficult, but she hadn't expected the overwhelming sadness that came with seeing Maya so withdrawn. One night, as Emma stood outside Maya's room, listening to the soft sound of her breathing, she whispered to John, "What if she never speaks? What if we never reach her?" John pulled Emma close. "We'll keep trying, no matter how long it takes. She needs us." And so they waited. Day after day, they offered Maya their love, their presence, hoping that one day she would feel safe enough to let them in. It wasn't until a few weeks later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, that something changed. Emma had been sitting on the porch, reading, while John worked in the garden. Maya had been playing with her dolls on the steps, as she often did, silently arranging them in neat rows. Suddenly, Emma heard a faint sound. She looked up, confused, her eyes scanning the yard. It was coming from Maya. "Mama." Maya's voice was barely a whisper, so soft that Emma almost thought she had imagined it. But when she looked at Maya, she saw her staring up at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "Mama," Maya repeated, her voice trembling. Emma's heart nearly stopped. It was the first word she had ever heard Maya say. But before Emma could react, Maya's face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes as she let out a soft, choked sob. Emma rushed to her, pulling her into her arms, holding her tightly as the little girl wept. "It's okay," Emma whispered, stroking her hair. "You're safe. You're safe now." But deep down, Emma knew that Maya's tears were not just about the present. They were about the past, about the unimaginable pain and fear she had endured before she found her way to them. And though Maya had finally spoken, Emma realized that the journey to uncovering the truth had only just begun. The quiet storm. The first word Maya uttered, "Mama," echoed in Emma's mind long after the moment passed. It was a small word, just 2 syllables, but it carried the weight of a mountain. The silence that had encased their lives since Maya's arrival had cracked ever so slightly, and Emma couldn't stop thinking about the little girl's quiet sobs. In the days that followed, Maya didn't speak again. It was as though the single word had been too much for her, and she retreated back into her silent world. Emma and John tiptoed around their fragile daughter, unsure of how to coax her out of her shell. They consulted therapists, read books on childhood trauma, and attended support groups for adoptive parents of children with special needs. But nothing in those sessions could prepare them for what Maya had been through. They knew Maya's mutism was more than just a simple behavioral issue. It was the key to a locked past, a past they had yet to uncover. On a rainy afternoon, Emma sat in Maya's room, watching her carefully arrange her dolls. The room was cozy, painted a soft lavender, with shelves filled with toys, books, and stuffed animals that Emma had picked out in hopes of making Maya feel at home. But no matter how inviting they tried to make her space, Maya remained a distant figure in their lives, always there, but always unreachable. "Do you want to play with me?" Emma asked softly, holding up a small tea set. Maya glanced at her, but made no move toward the toys. Instead, She continued to rearrange her dolls, setting them up in a perfectly straight line. Emma sighed inwardly, but kept a calm demeanor. Every day felt like a battle between patience and despair, but she was determined to wait for Maya to come to her. As Emma watched Maya, she began to notice something odd. Maya wasn't just playing with her dolls, she was arranging them in a pattern. Each doll was placed with care, spaced evenly apart, and their heads were all turned in the same direction. It wasn't random. There was an eerie precision to it. Emma had seen this behavior before. Maya's meticulous attention to detail, the way she lined up objects around the house. But today it felt different, almost deliberate, as though she were recreating something she had seen before. A shiver ran down Emma's spine. She wanted to ask Maya what she was doing, but she didn't want to frighten her. Instead, she stayed quiet, observing. Maya placed the last doll in line, then stood back, staring at them with an intensity that made Emma's heart ache. "Maya," Emma said gently, "what are you thinking about?" Maya didn't respond. She stood there, her tiny hands clenched into fists at her sides, her breathing shallow. Emma could see the tension in her small frame, as though she were holding something back, something too big for her to process. Emma tried again, this time picking up one of the dolls. "Do you want to tell me about them?" Suddenly, without warning, Maya reached out and grabbed the doll from Emma's hand, clutching it tightly to her chest. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were wide with fear. Emma's heart raced. What had she done to upset her? "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Emma said quickly, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. "You don't have to talk about it, if you don't want to." Maya didn't say a word, but her body language spoke volumes. She backed away, holding the doll protectively, her chest rising and falling with quick, panicked breaths. Emma wanted to comfort her, but she knew from experience that pushing too hard would only make things worse. So she stayed where she was, giving Maya space, even though every fiber of her being wanted to pull the little girl into her arms and tell her everything was going to be okay. As the days passed, Maya's behavior grew more erratic. She spent hours in her room, lining up her toys in strange, symmetrical patterns. She avoided eye contact more than usual, and there were times when Emma would find her staring out the window, her face blank, as though she were somewhere far, far away. Emma and John were at a loss. They had tried everything to reach Maya, but nothing seemed to work. They even brought in a child psychologist, Dr. Harris, who specialized in trauma-related mutism. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Dr. Harris said during one of their consultations. "Maya's behavior suggests that she's been through something deeply traumatic. The fact that she's not speaking is likely a protective mechanism. She's locking herself away in silence because it's the only way she knows how to cope." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. "But she said one word," she whispered. "She called me Mama. What does that mean?" Dr. Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That's significant. It means she's beginning to trust you. But trauma is complex, and recovery isn't a straight line. Sometimes, children like Maya take one step forward, and then several steps back. The important thing is that you're there for her consistently, offering her a safe space to express herself when she's ready." "But what if she never speaks again?" John asked, his voice betraying the frustration he usually kept so well hidden. Dr. Harris paused, choosing his words carefully. "She might not, or she might wake up one day and start talking as if she'd never stopped. Every child is different, but the fact that she called Emma Mama means she's opening up, even if it's just a crack." That night, after Dr. Harris left, Emma sat in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the conversation over and over again. What had Maya been through? What horrors were locked behind those silent eyes? And what would it take to help her heal? The breakthrough came on an ordinary evening, when Emma and John had almost given up hope of hearing Maya speak again. They were sitting at the dinner table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Maya sat across from them, picking at her food as she always did, her head down, eyes averted. Emma had learned not to push her to eat more. They had learned to give Maya space, to let her come to them when she was ready. But tonight, something felt different. Maya's hand, which had been motionless, suddenly began to tremble. She dropped her fork, the clatter of metal against the plate startling both Emma and John. They looked at each other, concern etched on their faces. "Maya, are you okay?" Emma asked softly. Maya didn't respond. Her small body was shaking now, her breathing quickening. Emma's heart raced as she watched her daughter, panic rising in her chest. What was happening? Suddenly, Maya let out a sound, a small, broken whimper, like a wounded animal. Emma's eyes widened. Was she trying to speak? "Maya, sweetheart," Emma said, her voice trembling. "It's okay. You're safe here. You can tell us anything." Maya's eyes shot up, meeting Emma's gaze for the first time in days. Her lips quivered, and for a moment, it seemed as though she was going to retreat back into silence. But then she spoke, her voice a barely audible whisper, yet full of terror. "Don't let him find me." Emma froze, her mind struggling to comprehend what she had just heard. "Who, Maya? Who are you talking about?" Maya's eyes filled with tears, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. "The bad man," she whispered. "He hurt me." Time seemed to stand still. Emma felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces as the words left Maya's mouth. John, who had been silently watching, placed a hand on Emma's shoulder, his face pale with shock. "What bad man, Maya?" Emma asked gently, trying to keep her voice steady. "Who hurt you?" Maya didn't answer. She shook her head violently, her entire body trembling now. Emma reached out, pulling her into her arms, holding her tightly as Maya sobbed uncontrollably against her chest. It took several minutes for Maya's sobs to quiet, but when they finally did, Emma knew their lives had changed forever. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, and the horrifying truth about Maya's past was slowly starting to unravel. The shadows of the past. The days that followed Maya's chilling words felt like a fog had settled over the Matthews household. Emma and John couldn't shake the dread that had taken root deep in their hearts. The bad man. Those words echoed in Emma's mind, haunting her every thought, filling her with questions that had no easy answers. What had Maya experienced? Who had hurt her, and why? Most of all, how could they protect her from someone they didn't even know? Maya had returned to her usual silence after that night, retreating back into her protective shell, as if uttering those few words had cost her all the strength she had. She was quieter than ever, her little body tensing every time she heard an unexpected noise, her eyes constantly darting around the room as though she expected someone to appear at any moment. Emma watched her closely, feeling the helplessness grow stronger with each passing day. She had been ready for challenges, prepared herself for the emotional ups and downs of adopting a child with trauma, but nothing could have prepared her for this. Every day felt like she was walking on eggshells, trying not to scare Maya further, while desperately wanting to know what she was so afraid of. John tried to keep things normal, to distract both Emma and Maya with little activities, puzzles, walks in the park, and movie nights with popcorn. But even he couldn't hide the tension. Every time Maya flinched at a sudden noise or stared into the distance with fear in her eyes, John would look at Emma, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. They were both in the dark, and it was tearing them apart. One evening, as Emma prepared dinner, her mind wandered back to Dr. Harris' words. Trauma is complex. Healing isn't a straight line. But they weren't just facing trauma. They were facing something unknown, a mystery locked behind the wall Maya had built around herself. And it wasn't just the mutism or the withdrawn behavior that worried Emma anymore. It was that glimpse of terror she had seen in Maya's eyes when she spoke of the bad man. As Emma stirred the pot on the stove, she heard a soft voice behind her. "Mama." The spoon slipped from Emma's hand, clattering against the counter. She turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. Maya stood in the doorway, her small figure illuminated by the kitchen light. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Maya had spoken again. "Maya," Emma said softly, kneeling down to her daughter's level. "What is it, sweetheart? Are you okay?" Maya's eyes were wide, and she clutched her teddy bear tightly to her chest. She didn't say anything for a moment, but then her lips trembled, and she spoke again. So quietly Emma had to strain to hear her. "He's coming." Emma's blood ran cold. "Who's coming, Maya? Who are you talking about?" Maya's gaze shifted toward the window, her little body tense with fear. "The bad man," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He's going to find me." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She pulled Maya into her arms, holding her tightly. "No one is going to find you here," she whispered, trying to keep her own fear from creeping into her voice. "You're safe with us. No one can hurt you now." But Maya didn't seem convinced. Her small body trembled in Emma's embrace, and Emma could feel her heart racing beneath her tiny chest. Maya's fear was real, tangible, and Emma knew that whatever had happened to her before she came into their lives, it was still haunting her. That night, after Maya had finally fallen asleep, Emma sat on the couch, her mind racing. John sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, but his presence didn't ease the knot of anxiety that had settled in Emma's stomach. "John, what are we going to do?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's terrified. I don't know how to help her." John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know either, Em. But we can't let this go on. We need to know more about her past. We need answers." "But how?" Emma asked, frustration and fear welling up inside her. "The social workers couldn't find any information about her. There's no record of her family, no clue about where she came from. It's like she just appeared." John frowned, deep in thought. "There's got to be something we're missing. Someone out there knows who she is, knows what happened to her." Emma bit her lip, feeling the weight of their situation pressing down on her. But what if? What if the person who knows is the same person she's afraid of? What if that man is still looking for her? The thought hung in the air between them, heavy and terrifying. They both knew it was a possibility, one they hadn't fully considered before. What if Maya's fear wasn't just the echo of past trauma? What if it was a warning? "We'll protect her," John said firmly, his voice resolute. "Whatever it takes, we'll keep her safe. But we need to figure out what we're up against." Emma nodded, but the fear gnawing at her insides didn't ease. She didn't want to wait for answers to come to them. She needed to know more. She needed to understand what had happened to Maya before she came into their lives, so she could protect her from whatever, or whoever, was still out there. The next morning, after dropping Maya off at her therapy session with Dr. Harris, Emma decided to take matters into her own hands. She had thought about doing this before, but now, after Maya's fearful words, she couldn't wait any longer. Emma drove to the Sunnyside orphanage, the place where they had first met Maya. She hadn't been back since the adoption was finalized, but today she was determined to dig deeper into Maya's past. Someone had to know something, anything that could help. The orphanage looked the same as she remembered it, modest, with its cheerful yellow walls, and a playground that now sat empty in the cool morning light. Emma parked the car and took a deep breath before heading inside. Mrs. Daniels, the social worker who had handled Maya's case, greeted her warmly at the reception desk. "Emma, it's so good to see you again. How's Maya doing?" Emma smiled, though it felt forced. She's doing okay. But actually, that's why I'm here. I need to ask you some questions about her past. I know you said you couldn't find much information before, but is there anything else you remember? Anything at all?" Mrs. Daniels' expression softened, her brow furrowing with concern. "I wish I had more to tell you, Emma. We tried everything, contacting the authorities, searching missing persons databases, but nothing came up. It's like she was never registered anywhere. No birth certificate, no medical records, nothing." Emma's heart sank. She had been hoping for a clue, some small detail that might lead them in the right direction. But it seemed like they were still at square one. "Has anyone ever come looking for her?" Emma asked, her voice quiet but filled with urgency. "Anyone suspicious?" Mrs. Daniels hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "There was one man," she said slowly, as if trying to recall the details. "He showed up a few months after Maya was brought in. He said he was a distant relative, but something about him didn't feel right. We didn't release any information to him, of course. I told him he'd need to go through the proper channels if he wanted custody of her, but he never came back." Emma's heart raced. "Did you get his name?" Mrs. Daniels shook her head. "No, he didn't leave any contact information, but I remember him asking a lot of questions about her, where she was found, if anyone else had inquired about her. It made me uneasy, but we never saw him again." Emma's stomach churned. Could this man be the one Maya was so afraid of? Could he be the bad man she had spoken of? "Do you remember what he looked like?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Daniels nodded, her face creased with worry. Tall, late 30s or early 40s. Dark hair, clean-shaven. He was well-dressed, but there was something about him. I can't explain it. He just didn't seem like someone who should be taking care of a child. Emma's mind raced. Whoever this man was, he hadn't given up on finding Maya. And if he was still out there, looking for her, then they were all in danger. "Thank you, Mrs. Daniels," Emma said, her voice tight with emotion. "You've been a huge help." As Emma left the orphanage, her heart pounded in her chest. She had more questions than answers now, but one thing was clear. Someone was out there, someone who wanted Maya back. And she would do whatever it took to protect her daughter from the shadows of her past. A race against time. Emma drove home from the orphanage, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess, spinning around the image of the man Mrs. Daniels had described, the man who had asked about Maya, the one who seemed so out of place. The bad man. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, searching for Maya, just as the little girl had feared. The knowledge that he might be close sent waves of panic through Emma's body. When Emma walked through the door, she found John in the living room, working on his laptop. He looked up when he saw her, his brow furrowing with concern as he noticed her pale face. "What happened?" he asked, closing the laptop and standing to meet her. Emma dropped her purse on the floor and sank into the armchair, her heart still racing. "I went to see Mrs. Daniels at the orphanage. She told me something I didn't expect." John knelt down beside her, his hand resting gently on her knee. "What did she say?" "There was a man," Emma whispered, her voice shaky. "He came to the orphanage a few months after Maya was brought in. He claimed to be a distant relative, but Mrs. Daniels didn't believe him. He asked a lot of questions about where Maya was found, if anyone had inquired about her." John's face hardened, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "Did she get his name?" Emma shook her head. "No, he didn't leave any contact information, and he never came back." "But John, what if that man is the one Maya's afraid of? What if he's the reason she was wandering alone in the park? What if he's the bad man she's been talking about?" John stood up and paced across the room, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "This changes everything. If he's still out there, he could be looking for her. We can't just sit here and do nothing." "I know," Emma said, her voice trembling. "But what can we do? We don't even know who he is or where he is. How are we supposed to protect her from someone we can't find?" John stopped pacing and looked at Emma, his eyes filled with determination. "We need to go to the police." Emma's heart skipped a beat. The police. It made sense, of course. It was the logical step. But the thought of involving the authorities made her uneasy. What if they couldn't do anything? What if this man found them before the police could act? John must have seen the hesitation in her eyes, because he came over and knelt down beside her again, taking her hands in his. "Emma, we have to do something. We can't just wait for this man to show up. We need to be proactive. If there's any chance that he's still looking for her, we need the police to know." Emma took a deep breath and nodded. "You're right. We'll go first thing tomorrow." That night, sleep didn't come easily. Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of Maya and the man who might still be out there. Every creak of the house made her jump. Every shadow outside the window made her heart race. She couldn't help but wonder if he was watching them, if he knew where they lived. What if he had been following them all along? When morning came, Emma and John drove to the local police station, leaving Maya with a trusted neighbor for a few hours. The station was small, a modest building nestled in the center of their quiet town, a place where major crimes were rare. As they walked inside, Emma felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She had never been in a situation like this before, never imagined she would be here, trying to protect her daughter from an unknown danger. They were greeted by a young officer at the front desk, who listened attentively as Emma and John explained their situation. The officer's face grew serious as they recounted what Mrs. Daniels had told them about the man who had inquired about Maya. When they mentioned Maya's fear of the bad man, the officer scribbled down notes, his brow furrowing in concern. "Do you have any other information about this man?" the officer asked. "Anything that might help us identify him?" Emma shook her head. "No, just what Mrs. Daniels told us. He was tall, in his late 30s or early 40s, dark hair. That's all we know." The officer leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk as he considered their words. "We'll need to reach out to the orphanage and get more details from them, but based on what you've told me, this is definitely something we'll look into. If this man posed as a relative, there's a possibility he's connected to Maya's past in some way." John nodded. "What do we do in the meantime?" "We just want to make sure Maya is safe." The officer gave them a sympathetic look. "For now, I'd recommend being cautious. If you notice anything unusual, anyone hanging around your home or following you, report it immediately. We'll assign someone to check in with you periodically, but until we know more, we can't take any direct action." Emma's heart sank. She had hoped for more, something more concrete, more immediate, but she knew they couldn't expect miracles. The police were doing what they could, and for now, all they could do was wait. When they returned home, Maya was sitting at the kitchen table, coloring quietly. She looked up when Emma and John entered, her eyes wide with curiosity, but she didn't say anything. Emma smiled, trying to hide the worry in her heart. "Hey, sweetheart," Emma said softly, brushing a hand over Maya's curls. "What are you drawing?" Maya looked down at her paper and pointed to the picture she had been working on. It was a house, much like the ones she often drew. But this time, there was something different about it. Standing next to the house was a small figure, a little girl with dark hair. And behind her, in the distance, was another figure, tall, with a shadowy face. Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Maya, who is that?" she asked gently, pointing to the shadowy figure. Maya didn't look up. Her hand tightened around the crayon, and she whispered, "He's coming." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The picture, the shadowy figure, was it the man from her past? The one she had spoken of in whispers, in terrified fragments. Emma had to force herself to stay calm, to keep her voice steady. "Maya, do you remember where you saw this man?" Maya's eyes flickered up to meet Emma's, and for the first time, Emma saw a glimmer of something in those dark eyes, something more than fear. It was recognition. She knew this man, and the memory of him was deeply embedded in her mind, lurking like a dark cloud. But Maya didn't answer. She simply put the crayon down, stood up from the table, and walked away, leaving the picture behind. That night, Emma and John sat at the kitchen table, staring at the drawing Maya had left behind. The house, the little girl, and the shadowy figure. It all felt like a warning, like Maya was trying to tell them something through the only way she knew how. But what? What did the shadowy figure mean? Was it just a memory, or was it something more? Emma couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Maya's fear seemed to be growing, and every day that passed without answers felt like they were getting closer to something terrible. The next morning, Emma decided to visit Dr. Harris, the child psychologist who had been working with Maya. He had been seeing her once a week since she came to live with them, but so far, Maya hadn't opened up much during their sessions. Still, Emma hoped that Dr. Harris might have some insight into what was happening, something that could help them understand Maya's fear and her silence. Dr. Harris welcomed Emma into his office with a warm smile. He was a kind man, with graying hair and a calm, reassuring presence. His office was filled with soft furniture and toys meant to make children feel at ease. But despite the cozy atmosphere, Emma's nerves were on edge. "I've been thinking a lot about Maya," Emma said, once they were seated. "She's been drawing these pictures of a man. She keeps saying that he's coming. I think it's connected to something in her past, but I don't know how to help her." Dr. Harris nodded thoughtfully. It's not uncommon for children who have experienced trauma to express their fears through drawing or play. The fact that she's drawing a shadowy figure could mean that she's trying to process the fear she still feels from that time in her life. It might not be a literal figure, but a symbol of the danger she felt. "But what if it's more than that?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if the man she's drawing is real?" Dr. Harris leaned forward, his eyes serious. "Emma, I understand how frightening this must be for you, but it's important to remember that Maya's fear might not be grounded in the present. Trauma has a way of distorting reality. What she's afraid of could be a lingering fear from the past, not necessarily something that's happening now." Emma wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this was all in Maya's mind, a remnant of her trauma. But the pit in her stomach wouldn't go away. The drawing, the way Maya had whispered, "He's coming," it felt like more than just fear. It felt like a warning. When Emma returned home, she found Maya sitting quietly on the porch, watching the street with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Emma sat beside her, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's back. "Maya," she said softly, "I promise you, no one is going to hurt you. Not while we're here." Maya looked up at Emma, her dark eyes filled with something Emma couldn't quite place, something deep and unspoken. And then, in a voice so soft Emma almost didn't hear it, Maya whispered, "You don't understand. He's already here." Unraveling the darkness, Emma sat frozen on the porch, Maya's soft words echoing in her mind. "He's already here." The weight of those words pressed down on her like a stone. Maya wasn't speaking metaphorically. Emma could feel it in the way her daughter's small, fragile body had tensed, in the haunted look in her eyes. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just a figure from her past. He was present, watching, lurking in the shadows. But where? And how close was he? The feeling of dread clung to Emma as she watched Maya's gaze flicker toward the street. She followed her daughter's line of sight, scanning the quiet suburban road. It was a peaceful neighborhood, with wide sidewalks, well-manicured lawns, and children's bicycles scattered across driveways. But today, everything felt different. The air seemed thicker, the sunlight less bright. It was as if the world had tilted ever so slightly, just enough to make Emma question everything she thought she knew about her surroundings. Was someone really watching them? Could the man Maya feared be that close? Emma's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of John's voice calling from inside the house. She stood up slowly, her heart racing, and placed a gentle hand on Maya's shoulder. "Why don't you come inside for a bit, sweetheart?" Emma suggested softly, trying to keep her voice calm despite the storm of fear inside her. "We can play one of your games or maybe read a story together." Maya didn't respond. She simply nodded, her small hand clutching Emma's as they walked back into the house. Emma could feel the tension in Maya's body, the way her fingers gripped tightly, as if holding on for dear life. It broke Emma's heart to see her daughter like this, so small, so scared, and unable to explain the horrors that haunted her. Inside, John was waiting for them in the living room, the worry lines on his face deepening as he saw the expression on Emma's face. He glanced down at Maya, and then back at Emma, his eyes filled with questions. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly, his gaze flicking between them. Emma swallowed hard and nodded, but the words came out in a whisper. She said, "He's already here." John's face paled, his eyes widening in disbelief. He crouched down beside Maya, his voice soft but urgent. "Maya, what do you mean, sweetheart? Did you see someone?" Maya remained silent, her gaze shifting to the floor. She pulled her hand away from Emma's grasp and clutched her teddy bear tightly, as though the simple toy could protect her from whatever darkness she felt closing in. John stood up, running a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched with frustration. "We need to call the police again," he said, his voice barely controlled. "We can't just wait around for something to happen." Emma nodded, knowing he was right, but her mind was spinning. The police had already been contacted, but what more could they do with so little information? She felt like they were trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to find answers. Every step forward seemed to push them deeper into a maze of fear and uncertainty. That night, after tucking Maya into bed, Emma and John sat together in the kitchen, the weight of the situation heavy in the air between them. "What do we do, John?" Emma whispered, her voice filled with despair. "We don't know who this man is. We don't know if he's even real or if it's just part of Maya's trauma. But what if he is real?" John finished, his voice grim. "What if he's watching us right now? What if Maya's right, and we're not as safe as we think?" Emma shuddered at the thought. The idea that someone could be lurking outside their home, waiting for the right moment to strike, sent a wave of terror through her. "We have to stay vigilant," John said after a long silence. "We'll lock all the doors and windows, and I'll set up some extra security cameras tomorrow. We'll talk to the police again, but in the meantime, we can't take any chances." Emma nodded, though the knot of fear in her stomach didn't loosen. She wished she could shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone was out there, waiting. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadowy figure from Maya's drawings, looming in the distance. The next day, John spent hours installing security cameras around the perimeter of the house. He placed them at every entry point, front door, back door, the garage, even the windows. The cameras would feed directly to an app on their phones, allowing them to monitor their home at all times. Emma spent the morning with Maya, trying to keep her distracted with games and puzzles, but the little girl was quieter than usual, her eyes darting to the windows whenever there was a sound outside. It was clear that Maya was on edge, and no amount of soothing words or comforting hugs could calm her. That afternoon, just as Emma was starting to feel a sliver of relief, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from the security app. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she opened the app, her hands trembling. The camera feed from the front door appeared on the screen, showing the quiet street outside. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first, just the usual view of their driveway and the road beyond. But then she saw it. A figure, far in the distance, barely visible but unmistakably there. He was standing at the end of the street, just at the edge of the camera's range, a tall figure dressed in dark clothes. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the house. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She blinked, hoping her eyes were playing tricks on her, but when she looked again, the figure was still there, still watching. "John." Emma's voice was sharp, filled with panic. John came rushing into the room, his face instantly filled with concern when he saw the fear in her eyes. "What is it? What's wrong?" Emma handed him the phone, her hand shaking. "Look at the camera. The front door." John took the phone and stared at the screen, his expression hardening as he saw the figure. He didn't say anything for a moment, but Emma could see the tension building in his body, his muscles tightening as he processed what he was seeing. "Stay here with Maya," John said finally, his voice calm but determined. "I'm going to check it out." "John." "No." Emma's voice cracked with fear. "Don't go out there. We don't know who he is or what he wants." "I'm not going far," John reassured her, though Emma could see the worry in his eyes. "I just want to get a better look. If he's still there, I'll call the police." Emma bit her lip, fear clawing at her insides, but she knew there was no stopping him. John was a protective man, and he wasn't the type to sit back and wait for danger to come to them. Still, the thought of him walking out there, unarmed, filled her with dread. John grabbed the phone and slipped out the front door, moving quietly but with purpose. Emma stood by the window, watching him as he walked to the end of the driveway, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of the figure. And then, nothing. The figure was gone. Emma's heart sank. She had seen him. They had both seen him. But now he was gone, as if he had vanished into thin air. John stayed outside for a few minutes longer, circling the house, checking the yard and the street, but there was no sign of the man anywhere. When he finally came back inside, his face was pale, his jaw tight with frustration. "He's gone," John said, his voice low. "Whoever it was, they're not there anymore." Emma's mind raced. What does that mean? Did he leave because he saw you coming? Or was he never really there? John shook his head, rubbing the back of his neck in frustration. "I don't know them. But I don't like it. Someone's watching us. I don't know why or what they want, but they're out there." The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. Emma kept checking the security feed, watching for any sign of the figure returning, but there was nothing. The street remained quiet, the neighborhood peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But Emma knew better. She could feel it in her bones. The threat was real, and it was closing in on them. That evening, as Emma and John sat in the living room, trying to relax after the tense day, the phone rang. Emma jumped at the sound, her heart racing. John quickly answered, his voice calm as he spoke. "Hello." A pause. Emma watched as John's face changed, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "Who is this?" John asked, his voice growing tense. Another pause. Then, John's face went pale, his hand gripping the phone tightly. "Stay away from my family," John said, his voice low and dangerous. Emma's heart stopped. She could hear the faint sound of a man's voice on the other end of the line, but she couldn't make out what he was saying. John's face was a mask of fury, his knuckles white, as he held the phone to his ear. And then the line went dead. John lowered the phone, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. He turned to Emma, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and fear. "It was him," John said quietly. "The man from the orphanage. He knows where we are." Emma's blood ran cold. The man, the bad man, wasn't just a figment of Maya's imagination. He was real, and now he had made contact. He knew where they lived. He had been watching them, and now he was coming for Maya. A confrontation with fate. Emma's entire body felt cold. The walls of the house, once filled with warmth and hope for a new beginning with Maya, now seemed to close in around her. The phone call had shattered the illusion of safety they had worked so hard to create. The bad man was real, and he was closing in. Emma could feel the fear coursing through her veins, but as she looked at John, his jaw clenched, his fists tightly balled. She knew there was no time to give in to panic. They had to protect Maya, whatever it took. "John," Emma said softly, trying to steady her voice. "What did he say? How did he find us?" John exhaled deeply, his eyes still dark with anger. "He didn't say much, just that he knew where we lived and that he was coming for Maya. I tried to keep him on the phone, but he hung up before I could get anything useful. But it was him. I know it." The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Emma's mind raced. How could they stop this man? The police had been notified. The security cameras were in place, but somehow, this man, this shadow from Maya's past, had found them. The thought of him getting anywhere near their daughter made Emma's stomach churn with terror. Maya. Emma glanced toward the hallway where Maya's bedroom door was slightly ajar. She could hear the faint sound of her daughter's breathing as she slept, unaware of the nightmare that was closing in around her. For a moment, Emma was gripped by an overwhelming need to go to her, to hold her close, to keep her safe from the world. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. They needed help. "We have to go to the police again," Emma said, her voice firm. "We can't just wait for him to show up. We need to take action now." John nodded, though his expression remained grim. "I'll call them again. Maybe they can trace the number or send someone out here to keep watch." As John dialed the police, Emma grabbed her phone and walked quickly down the hall, her heart pounding with every step. She entered Maya's room as quietly as she could, careful not to wake her. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a nightlight, casting long shadows across the walls. Maya was curled up under her blanket, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. Emma knelt beside her daughter's bed, brushing a strand of hair away from Maya's forehead. The little girl's face, so peaceful in sleep, was a stark contrast to the fear that consumed her waking hours. Emma's heart ached as she looked at her, so small, so fragile. She couldn't let anything happen to her. Not now, not ever. "I won't let him hurt you," Emma whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise." But even as she said the words, the fear gnawed at her. What if they couldn't stop him? What if he found a way to get to Maya, no matter what they did? The thought sent a wave of nausea through her, but she pushed it aside. She had to stay strong. For Maya, for John, for their family. By the time Emma returned to the living room, John was finishing his call with the police. He hung up and turned to her, his expression tense. "They're sending an officer to watch the house tonight," John said, running a hand through his hair. "But it's not enough. They said they'll investigate the phone call, but without more information, there's not much they can do. We're on our own until they can find him." Emma's stomach churned. "What do we do, John? We can't just wait for him to make the next move." "We don't have a choice," John said quietly, though the frustration was clear in his voice. "But we're not going to let him take her. We'll stay up, keep an eye on the cameras. If he shows up, we'll be ready." And so the long night began. Emma and John sat in the living room, their eyes glued to the security feed on the laptop, watching for any sign of movement outside. The hours crawled by, each one more agonizing than the last. The tension in the house was palpable, the silence thick with fear and anticipation. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, made Emma's heart race. But as the night wore on, nothing happened. No sign of the shadowy figure, no phone calls, no movement on the cameras. By the time the early hours of morning crept in, the exhaustion had begun to take its toll. John's eyes were heavy, his body slouched in the chair, but Emma couldn't let herself rest. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not for a second. It was around 4 a.m. when Emma noticed something odd on the security feed. The front door camera, which had been still and quiet for hours, suddenly flickered. For a split second, the screen went dark, and then it came back on. Emma leaned in closer, her heart pounding. Something wasn't right. "John," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "Look at the front door camera." John jerked awake, blinking in confusion before his eyes focused on the screen. The camera flickered again, and then, there it was. A figure, moving closer. It was the same figure they had seen before. The same tall, shadowy man, dressed in dark clothes. He was standing at the edge of the driveway, just out of the camera's full view. But this time, he wasn't standing still. He was moving closer. Slowly, deliberately, he walked toward the house, his steps unnervingly calm. Emma's breath caught in her throat. This was it. He was here. "John, he's coming." Emma's voice was filled with panic as she grabbed her phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed the police again, praying they would get there in time. John stood up, his body tense as he stared at the screen. "I'll go lock the doors," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Stay here with the phone. Keep watching the cameras." Emma nodded, her heart racing as she clutched the phone to her ear, listening to the distant ringing on the other end. The figure moved closer, his face still obscured by the shadows, but Emma could see the outline of his body now. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a menacing stillness to his movements. 911. "What's your emergency?" The operator's voice crackled through the phone, pulling Emma back into the moment. "He's here," Emma gasped, her voice shaking. "The man. The one we reported earlier. He's outside our house, coming closer. Please, you have to send someone now." The operator's voice remained calm, professional. "Ma'am, stay on the line. I'm dispatching officers to your location. Lock your doors and stay inside." John returned a moment later, his face set in grim determination. "Doors are locked. Windows too. The back is secure." Emma's eyes remained fixed on the screen, watching as the figure continued to move closer. He was at the edge of the yard now, just a few steps away from the porch. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing. What was he going to do? Why was he here? And most importantly, how could they stop him? John grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, his face pale but resolute. "If he tries to get in." "He won't," Emma interrupted, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. "The police will get here in time." But even as she said the words, a part of her didn't believe it. The police were minutes away, but the man was already so close. Too close. Suddenly, the figure stopped. He was standing at the base of the porch steps now, just a few feet from the front door. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him, waiting for his next move. And then, he looked up. For the first time, the camera caught a glimpse of his face, illuminated by the faint glow of the porch light. Emma's breath hitched in her throat. The man's face was hard, angular, with dark eyes that seemed to gleam in the light. But there was something else, something familiar. A cold chill ran down Emma's spine. She knew that face. "Maya's drawings," she whispered, her eyes widening with realization. "That's him. It's him." John's grip tightened on the bat, his eyes locked on the screen. "If he tries to get in." But the man didn't try to enter. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and shiny. Emma squinted at the screen, trying to make out what it was. A key. The man held it up, letting it catch the light before slowly turning toward the front door. "How does he have a key?" Emma gasped, her mind reeling. "He couldn't." Before she could finish the thought, the front door handle rattled. John tensed, raising the bat, but the door didn't open. The lock held firm. Emma's heart raced, her body trembling with adrenaline. She could hear the distant wail of sirens now, growing louder as the police approached. The man at the door turned his head, as if listening to the sound of the sirens. He paused for a moment, his expression unreadable, and then he stepped back. Without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Emma and John stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests as they watched the security feed, waiting for some sign of the man's return. But the screen remained still. The man was gone. Minutes later, the police arrived, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the yard. Emma and John rushed to meet them, explaining everything that had happened. The officers searched the area, but there was no sign of the man. He had vanished. That night, after the police left and the house had quieted once again, Emma stood by Maya's bedside, watching her sleep. The fear still clung to her, but there was a strange calmness in the air now, as if the danger had passed, at least for the moment. John joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "He's not going to stop, is he?" Emma whispered, her voice filled with worry. John shook his head. "No, but we'll be ready. We'll protect her." As Emma looked down at her sleeping daughter, she felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. Whoever that man was Whatever his connection to Maya, they wouldn't let him take her. They would fight for her, no matter what it took. The next morning, after a sleepless night, they sat together in the kitchen, going over the police report and discussing their next steps. They didn't know who the man was, not yet, but they had something now, something tangible. They had seen him. They had seen his face. And they knew, deep down, that this was far from over. But for now, Maya was safe, and they would do everything in their power to keep it that way.